Welcome back to the second part of our series on poison as murder weapon, brought to you by the Indian Society of Toxicology. In part 1, we had dealt with some of the preliminary aspects, which I think will serve as a good preamble for part 2, in which we will go a little bit more detail into this topic, a very relevant and important topic, a neglected topic that I think is time all of us gave some importance to. We are entering an era where poisoning is being increasingly used for nefarious purposes, be it homicide or assault or date rape or even mass murders or serial murders. It is important all doctors get to know something about the basics of homicidal poisoning, and this program I think will also be useful to law enforcement officers, including police officers and the judiciary. We will be looking at some landmark cases, and with the help of such cases, I would hope that the viewers will get to know the potential with regard to poisons being used for homicidal purposes, as to how poisoning can be much more effective than conventional weapons used for committing murder, like knives or firearms or weapons like that. We will begin with a landmark case where somebody almost got away after poisoning a person, and in fact he attempted to poison an entire family. If it had not been for some alert doctors and meticulous investigation by the police, he would have most likely got away with it. So it serves as a very good example of how poisoning can be near perfect when employed for murder. I'm talking about the George Tripal case. George Tripal case is now one of the most celebrated, if I may use that expression, cases of homicide by poisoning, where this man almost got away with it. The case is from the 1980s. George Tripal and his wife moved into their home in Florida, USA, during the early 1980s, and their neighbors happened to be the Carr family, next door neighbors. There was Mr. and Mrs. Carr and their 2 sons. Unfortunately, the neighborly relations that were to be expected between these two families never happened, and there was a lot of conflict, mainly because the Carr family was a kind of outgoing family who believed in a lot of fun and excitement, so they had frequent parties in their home, a lot of music and stuff like that. And the Tripal family, comprising mainly George Tripal and his wife, they wanted solitude. They were not very outgoing kind of people, and they certainly were not happy with the kind of noise that was emanating from next door. So the conflicts happened regularly and went to the extent of an unsigned letter being received by the Carr family, most probably from their neighbors, in which there was a kind of threat to their lives if they did not leave their home. For that matter, they were asked to leave the state of Florida itself, The letter was unsigned, it was anonymous, but as we will see later, most probably it was written by George Trepal himself, and he hoped that that letter would scare the family, the Carr family, and they would leave their house. That did not happen, and in October 1988, the lady of the house in the Carr family, that is Peggy Carr, began to suffer from a mysterious illness. She was admitted to hospital and was discharged after several days, but after discharge, again she relapsed and had to be readmitted to the hospital. Her two sons also exhibited similar symptoms and were also admitted to hospital. Doctors were at first puzzled, but then began to suspect poisoning, and because of the manifestations, they thought that it could be some heavy metal like thallium. And so the body fluids were submitted for analysis and came out as positive for thallium. In the meanwhile, Peggy Carr's condition unfortunately worsened. She fell into a coma and she died in March 1989. Fortunately, the others recovered. By this time, of course, the police entered the picture. It was a case of a suspected murder, and the police went to the Carr household first to find out the possible origin of the thallium that was detected in the lady who died. And in the course of investigating in the house, they came across several empty Coca-Cola bottles. And there was a suspicion that maybe the poison originated from them. The residue from these bottles were tested in the laboratory and were found to contain thallium. So the police were certain now about the source, and they wanted to know whether it was accidental kind of contamination that occurred in this particular lot of the soft drink. And they went to the extent of finding out the lot numbers to trace where and when the bottles are produced. All that they did, and came to the conclusion that actually the bottles, when they were first brought out of the factory, they did not contain any thallium, and obviously somebody introduced the thallium later on after the bottles were purchased. If you would recall, I had mentioned about an anonymous letter that the Carrs had received. This was in June 1988, where it was mentioned that if they did not leave Florida, they would be killed. So the prosecution linked George Trepal to this letter because of the history of the case which was emerging by now, and also because of certain comments that Trepal made during a police interview. He had been interrogated as a possible suspect after this incident, and during the course of that he had mentioned some things which were very, very suspicious indeed. With regard to the possibility of Trepal entering the Carr's residence and contaminating deliberately the bottles of Coca-Cola with thallium, that was possible because unfortunately the Carr's family did not really believe in locking their doors even when they left the house for some purpose, and often it was unlocked. So there was definitely opportunity for Trepal to enter surreptitiously, and that was found out by the police. And they also found that Trepal had worked as a chemist in an amphetamine laboratory, an illegal laboratory in the past, and we all know that thallium is a byproduct of amphetamine production. So access to thallium was also possible with regard to Trepal. In order to further investigate Trepal, Special Agent Susan Gorek went undercover, and she attended a Mensa murder weekend that Trepal's wife organized under the name of Sherry Ginn. Trepal wrote a pamphlet for this weekend that described writing a threatening note and then poisoning the recipient of the note, very eerily similar to what really happened in the Carr family. By the way, Mensa refers to an organization, international organization, where the main qualification that you should have for entry is a high intelligence quotient. It is an organization with only one main criterion, and that is you should have a high IQ to become a member. George Trepal and his wife were both members, which indicated both of them had pretty high IQ. And this organization has all kinds of programs conducted, and one of the programs was what I just referred to, where a murder scenario is created, and then the people who are present should solve that particular case, and points or marks are awarded. And that was the kind of programs that were regularly organized and attended by the Tripal couple. Now, during this particular weekend, Susan Gorek had contacted Tripal and learned that he was selling his Alturas residence and was planning to move to another part of Florida or even to another state like Virginia. So what she did was she arranged to rent Tripal's home after he and his wife had moved, and then she went along with a search team to the home which is now vacant, and thoroughly searched the whole place, including the garage, where the police found evidence of thallium, and that was very incriminating indeed. On the discovery of this thallium, Tripal was considered as suspect number 1. He was arrested and charged with 7 counts of poisoning. And a subsequent search of Tripal's Sebring home turned up even more incriminating evidence in the form of chemistry books and equipment, including information about poisons. And very significantly, in his home, the investigators also found the famous Agatha Christie novel Pale Horse, which is a story where thallium is a means of murdering people, described in that book. As you all know, Agatha Christie is very famous for writing mystery novels, and she was a best-selling author of a lot of novels where she described a variety of methods of murder, some of them dealing with poisons. And this particular novel, The Pale Horse, dealt with thallium. It was subsequently made into a film also. I have read the book, I have watched the film, and I would suggest all those who are interested in poisoning to read the book especially, and maybe even watch the film. It's pretty engaging and quite gripping. And all these things were now adding up with regard to Tripal, and the police were now pretty convinced that he's the main perpetrator, and maybe his wife was also involved, but that they were not sure. So they made a further search, even more thorough, and found what they were looking for all the time, and that is a bottle capping machine. Because after all, the Coca-Cola bottles, after the thallium was introduced, they were recapped properly, as if came straight from the factory. As a result of which, the Carr family never suspected anything. So the police were always wondering as to how this was done. And when they came across this machine, the bottle capping machine in Tripal's home, that was the last nail in George Tripal's coffin, so to speak. He was now charged with murder, and he was convicted subsequently and sentenced to death. In fact, he is still on death row. Even though he has appealed several times against the sentence, that has not been revoked so far. This case, I think, serves as a very good example of the potential of poisoning being almost a kind of perfect method to commit murder. If it had not been for the alert, doctors in the hospital where the lady, Peggy Carr, had been admitted, if it had not been for the meticulous investigation of the police, George Tripal probably would have escaped, and nobody would have even known that it was a case of murder. So I think cases like this, which are cropping up every now and then, emphasize the fact that poisoning is one of the best methods of committing murder, and that is why doctors, police officers, and all those involved in criminal investigation should know really more about poisoning. Otherwise, we may have cases where almost perfect murder has been committed and the perpetrator is never caught. So, when to suspect poisoning? That is important for doctors as well as the police. I have in this particular slide listed some clues in a living person which can suggest that perhaps he is being poisoned. There could be, a victim who is having sudden unexplained weakness, fainting, giddiness, loss of consciousness, and nothing to explain this. Or it could be somebody, with unexplained stomachache, headache, or body ache, Again, no cause to explain any of these. Investigations are all turning up negative. The conventional investigations, I mean, not toxicological investigations. Or it may be a person with sudden onset of vomiting or diarrhea, and you have ruled out food poisoning. Or it may be somebody with progressive illness for which diagnosis is unclear, or periodic illness alternating with good health, unexplained hair loss, skin changes, visual problems, weight loss. These are all things which should raise the index of suspicion. When such a patient, a doctor encounters, he should have the suspicion that it could be related to poisoning. That's about the living. And in the dead, if you have history of somebody who has died unexpectedly and suddenly, that's something which should be investigated. Also, death associated with unexplained vomiting or stomachache, diarrhea. If any of these have preceded the death, again, you have to be very suspicious. You have to submit the body to a detailed autopsy, submit, viscera and body fluids for analysis and so on and so forth. So also cases of, unexplained death in healthy adults or especially children, the index of suspicion should be very high because you really don't expect death there. And it can also be death associated with convulsions in a non-epileptic victim, or a slow death associated with neurological problems or nausea, weakness, hair loss. All these things, if they are there in the history preceding the death of somebody, you should always think of poisoning and make it a police case. With regard to autopsy, if a case like this, has been taken up by the police and they subject the body to post-mortem examination, there are some important clues for a doctor who does such an autopsy to find out as to whether it could be really a case of poisoning or not. There could be evidence of vomiters or stools on or around the dead body. There could be frothing at the mouth or nose, bluish face or extremities because of cyanosis. Many a case, ends up in respiratory failure. There could be unusual smells in the vicinity of corpse, extremely important. And if there is something like that, then it is mandatory to submit viscera and body fluids for chemical analysis to rule out poisoning or to confirm it. There could also be peculiar staining of clothes or skin or signs of forcible feeding, injection marks. These are all important signs to look for at autopsy. And yes, there are some poisons, especially heavy metals like arsenic, which are known to retard decomposition. So if you find a body that has been buried and then subsequently exhumed in relatively good condition, then there's a high chance that the retardation of decomposition may be because of the poison itself. With regard to the police, as to what they should do at the scene of a possible case of poisoning where somebody has died, evidence preservation is extremely important. Whatever that appears to be important should be collected, because you should not look back and regret that something that was there that could have been collected was not done. Once evidence is lost, it is forever. And the dead body itself, of course, must be subjected to post-mortem examination by a qualified forensic pathologist as far as possible, not just by an MBBS doctor or a non-forensic specialist, because cases like this already very complicated. You require somebody with good qualifications and experience to do the examination. All the relevant body fluids and viscera must be preserved for chemical analysis. We'll take a look at the list of what should be preserved a little later. And yes, it's important. You should not allow cremation of the dead body until investigation is complete. Once the dead body is burnt, you have burnt all the evidence, and later on you will not be able to get anything out of the ashes. And as far as possible, consult a toxicologist or a poison control center if it is accessible for guidance in such cases. Coming to the kinds of body fluids and viscera to be submitted for chemical analysis in a case of death due to suspected poisoning. On this particular slide, you see the routine viscera and body fluids that must be, preserved in the case of all kinds of poisons, whatever be the nature. And this is kind of a mandatory list, and nothing should be missed out as far as possible. Stomach and contents, extremely important. Small intestine, not the whole of it, because it's a huge, kind of a entity. It may not be easy to, preserve the entire thing. So what's recommended is first 30 centimeter to be cut out along with the contents and preserved. and liver about 500 grams, minced properly and preserved properly. Also, one kidney or one half of each kidney, also cut into small pieces. These are the viscera that you should be preserving. And then body fluids, of course, blood and urine. Blood may be 10 ml and urine maybe 50 ml in chemically clean containers. Now, if you have any particular suspicion as to what kind of poison it may be, you can preserve additional viscera. In addition to what I have just listed, you can preserve any one of these depending on the kind of poison. Like for instance, if it is alcohol, then in addition to the routine viscera and body fluids, you can also attempt to collect and preserve cerebrospinal fluid for analysis, because alcohol is likely to be present in this fluid in good quantity and it may be well preserved, unlike in blood or urine. And all neurotoxic poisons, it is always preferable to preserve in addition half of brain, one cerebral hemisphere. If it is spinal poison, spinal cord and so on and so forth. If it is a cardiac poison, of course, the heart. And if it is heavy metals, extremely important to preserve hair and bone. And in the case of injected poisons or corrosives, the affected portion of the skin. Inhaled poisons may be one lung in airtight container. So this is special viscera or body fluids in addition to routine viscera. And with regard to preservatives, of course, never preserve in formalin. Formalin is to be used as a preservative only for histopathological examination, whereas for poisoning cases, what is really preferred is rectified spirit. And if that is not available, saturated saline should be all right. For blood, it can be a mixture of fluoride oxalate, and for urine, it can be just sodium fluoride. This is what is recommended. But I'm not very sure whether we should be doing that, in all cases, because forensic science laboratories or chemical examiners laboratories in India are already overloaded with a lot of cases, lot of samples. Sometimes I feel that just blood and urine would do in most of the cases, and if at all it is required, you can perhaps add stomach and stomach contents and liver and all that, depending on the case. I don't think we should insist that in every case you submit so many viscera and body fluids, because it causes a lot of overload and problems in the laboratories, and in some cases you don't have to have access to all these kinds of viscera and body fluids. Anyway, that matter is a separate kind of thing. We'll discuss it in some other session. That is with regard to the main discussion in this particular episode. But let us look at how poisoning has really been employed in India, and many of us did not know about it, for committing murder. And some of these cases that I'm going to show you, some of these cases are actually serial poisonings, where somebody has got away with several murders before finally being caught. One of the most infamous among these serial poison killers of India is, of course, K.D. Kempamma, whose image is shown here. She went by the nickname Cyanide Mallika after she was caught. And she confessed to killing not less than 6 victims, if I remember right, 6 women, over a period of a few years. And she used cyanide to kill them. Before finally she was caught, she happens to be the first woman in India to be convicted of a serial killing. And she was sentenced to death initially, but now I think it has been commuted to life in prison. All the crimes that she committed were in Karnataka, close to Bangalore. And she's, I believe, now in prison in Karnataka, sentenced to life. So that is one example of India's, serial poison killers. The second and equally notorious example is that of Cyanide Mohan or Mohan Kumar of Mangalore, whose image is displayed here. He was even more prolific a serial killer than Kempamma. He committed a series of 20 murders, whether you believe it or not, mostly with cyanide. And most of his victims were women, and the crime span took place over, I think, 10 years before finally he was caught. He is sentenced to death. He's been convicted, and now I think he's awaiting a death penalty. So far, his appeals have not been, accepted, and he is still on death row awaiting execution. So this is another example of India's serial poison killer, and he committed, 20 murders before finally he was caught. Then, of course, this particular case, which is going on in Kerala, the so-called, Jolly, cyanide killer. Jolly is the name of the lady. The image depicted here. Of course, this matter is still sub judice, so we will not say for sure that she is really the perpetrator. But I must tell you that she has confessed already to the police that she has killed 6 victims in her family over a period of, I think, 14 years. The motive behind all that is only emerging now. Investigation is still going on. She is still in custody, and she has come to be known as Cyanide Jolly. Her name is Jolly Joseph, but as I said, the matter is still sub judice, so we cannot really say for sure as to whether she was responsible or not, even though she has confessed to these killings. She also used cyanide quite successfully without arousing suspicion. And then there is a case of this man recently caught, I think just about a year ago or a year and a half ago. This man goes by the name Cyanide Shiva, though his name is actually Simhadri. He's from Andhra, and he killed not less than 10 people over a span of just 20 months, over a span of just about a couple of years. And he also used cyanide, and the motive was, monetary gain. He was caught. He is now in police custody. The investigation is going on. I believe he has confessed, but the police is gathering evidence in order to bring him to trial. So you can see as to how even in a country like India, so many kinds of cases have been committed with poisons, and people have been getting away with a lot of murders before finally they were caught. We do not know for sure how many other cases may have gone under the radar. And then how can we forget about this case which is now going on in Kerala? Not exactly a serial kind of killing, but a man who tried to kill his wife first time with a snake, which is in itself a very unique method of committing murder. And then when he did not succeed, he attempted it one more time just a few months after the first incident, and then succeeded in killing his wife. This man is Suraj. He is also from Kerala, and again the motive is monetary gain. The case is under investigation. He initially confessed to the police, but now he's retracted the confession, and the case is now going on. We will not comment further on it, but I'm showing you this particular case. I'm talking about this because the method of homicide is so unique, using a snake as a murder weapon. And of course, when you use that kind of creature which has venom, it comes under toxicology. So you can see the variety of kinds of poisons that can be used and the variety of exotic methods that can be employed with regard to poisoning for committing murder. But the most prolific serial killer of all time is no doubt Dr. Harold Shipman, who used morphine or some opiate related to morphine for killing nearly, I think, 250 of his patients over a period of time. He's an English physician, or I should say he was an English physician. He mostly, I think, operated between 1975 to 1998 when he was caught, and the investigation was done and revealed very clearly evidence of at least 15 victims whose bodies were exhumed. All of them were his patients. And when the samples from these bodies were analyzed chemically in a forensic toxicology laboratory, evidence of morphine was detected in all of them. The remaining cases, exhumation was not done because by this time enough proof was obtained to convict him for murder, and 15 cases is more than sufficient. The police brought him to trial. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. In the UK, as you all know, there is no death sentence. Otherwise, perhaps he would have been sentenced to death. In any case, he committed suicide in prison. Just a few years after he was sent to prison for life, he hanged himself in his prison cell, I think in 2004. So he has come to be known as Dr. Death. He is the most prolific serial killer of all time, and he used poisoning as the preferred method of dispatching his victims, which is a very good kind of example that poisoning is much more effective as a method of killing somebody or killing a lot of people over a period of time without arousing suspicion. And if you want to know more about this kind of cases, I can recommend this book, excellent book, Criminal Poisoning by John Harris Trestrail III. He is considered to be one of the experts, real experts in criminal poisoning. He is based in Michigan, USA. I have read this book and it's very gripping. I believe that the third edition has been released recently. I read the second edition, and there is a preface to that edition, and in that this is mentioned: if all those buried in our cemeteries were poisoned could raise their hand, we would probably be shocked by the numbers. John Trestrail wrote this only to indicate that, poisoning is an entity that many people may not suspect in murder, and we do not know as to how many cases of murder actually go undetected because the suspicion was never raised in the first place. I think you should be reading this book. I know it's pretty costly. It's a slim volume, but pretty costly. And I would also, at the risk of sounding immodest, recommend to you my own book. This is a comprehensive medical toxicology. Incidentally, John Trestrail reviewed this book and gave it, whether you believe it or not, pretty good, kind of opinion on the book. It was the third edition was released in 2018. I'm working on the fourth edition, and I think this book will be really interesting to all those who are interested in toxicology. It's a very comprehensive kind of book and contains a lot of case histories also. So case histories like the ones that I've described in this particular episode. So we come to the end of the episode on poison as a murder weapon. We have looked at all the aspects, I think more or less comprehensively, and if at all there is something more to be dealt with, we will take it up in part 3. But that is not something that I've decided. Let me see whether we have missed out something. If there are any comments that you would like to offer, anything else that need to be discussed, you can let me know, so that if necessary we will have part 3 of this very important topic in toxicology. So that's it from me and the Indian Society of Toxicology. Thank you, and keep watching. We will be uploading videos like this regularly. Goodbye.